Hello, everyone. Welcome to the United Nations Global Compact Academy for today. Welcome to all the people that are joining us from all parts of Europe and from Brazil, from the UK, from Germany, and from Argentina. We are having participants from Serbia, from France, from Poland, from Madrid. Welcome to all of you. Athens, Turkey, Portugal, Italy. Istanbul, the Philippines, and the US. Wow. India, Brazil, South Africa, London, Ukraine, Zurich, Amsterdam, Paris, Boston, the US, and Iceland. From Wales, from Canada, from Boston, from Montreal. So this is going to be a truly international session. We have visitors from Iceland. We have from Eindhoven. We will start in a few moments. We are just getting ready. More people from Ukraine. And from Georgia as well. Great. So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Lise Kingo, the CEO and Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact. Welcome to an informal conversation about leadership in the perspective of COVID-19. Today we are hosting multiple Global Compact academies together with our local networks on this key topic across the world. In China, in Asia Pacific, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Latin America. And I would like to welcome you now to the European session, where we have a fantastic panel. So allow me to welcome our panelists, Frans Timmermans, Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal at the European Commission, Olga Algerova, Executive Secretary at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, Frans van Houten, the CEO for Royal Philips, and Victor Smith, Executive Chairman of NetGuru. So in February, Global Compact launched a COVID-19 call to action based on our 10 universal principles to offer a frame to businesses across the world to take action on the pandemic, towards employees, towards their supply chain, and all other stakeholders. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, has called the COVID-19 the fight of a generation and the raison d'etre for the United Nations itself. And he encourages the global community to build back better, anchored in the 2030 Agenda and in the Paris Climate Agreement as the road to recovery. To our audience today, thank you so much for submitting great questions prior to our event. We have tried to build them into the conversation that we will have over the next 45, 60 minutes. Before we get started, I just want to bring your attention to the fact that we have simultaneous French translation available for this session. So you can select your channel, I believe, at the bottom of your screen for French language if you want to do so. We are ready to get started. And I'm keen to ask our panelists first what the immediate learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic has been, and how we can bring these actions into building a better future in Europe. So, Mr. Timmermans, welcome. It's an honor to have you on the panel today.
Thank you.
May I start with you? So from the perspective of the European Union, what are some of the major lessons learned in your mind from countries' response to the pandemic, to the crisis, and also what has it taught us in terms of the importance of multilateralism?
Well, I think first of all, we've learned that, of course, there are national differences, and in our response, national differences will be taken into account, even regional differences. But at the same time, we've seen again how dependent we are on each other, and that we need to find common solutions to common problems at a continental scale, and I would even argue at a global scale. My other lesson I've learned is the incredible heroism of the first responders, of people working in healthcare, who selflessly tried to save so many people and were so successful. The resilience of social systems and the strength of, I think, societies where social systems are entrenched into the way society is organized and the values that are shared by citizens. I think there is also clearly an understanding that we have a problem with our relationship with our natural environment, that we are more vulnerable than we thought, and that we need to find solutions to reduce our vulnerability and to increase our resilience, which is a more positive way of saying it. And finally, I would say what we've also have learned, that we really need a strong multilateral international system to be able to respond to pandemics that really don't discriminate between nations and between continents. So these would be my first takeaways. I mean, there's so many more things to say, but these would be my first few lines on what we've learned so far.
Thank you so much, Mr. Timmermans. I think your points resonate so well, and Ms. Ajelarova, I want to hear your perspectives from the UN. I mean, you run a very important organization that is based in Geneva, but how would you define the key learnings and also the social and economic consequences that we have seen from the pandemic?
Good afternoon, Mr. Timmermans. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lisa, for giving me the floor. So from our perspective, I believe everybody would understand, the impact of COVID-19 is multifaceted. First, we see the health impact. Just the UK, Italy, Spain, France alone account for over 110,000 deaths. Second, we need to speak about economic impact. The GDP is expected to contract significantly. Projections range between 5 and 12% just in Eurozone, making it one of the worst recessions since World War II. Unemployment and poverty are rising, with many unable to work. Last but not least, socially, the crisis is creating our compounding inequality. Students who cannot afford computers cannot access online education. Gender-based violence has risen in confined populations, with many in informal employment losing their jobs. Income inequality is exacerbated. More and more people are now being left behind. In terms of lessons learned, we see a need for governments to work together to reduce this uncertainty. There is need for a human rights-based approach to eradicate these inequalities I mentioned. We witness that international cooperation can minimize disruption and cost. We needed also at the UN some time, especially at the outset, to put international solidarity and multilateralism first in our responses, and subsequently our action aligned. Yet there is still scope for further improvement. The pandemic has shown that we can do things to mitigate and possibly even prevent certain risks from materializing it if we have the political will to act. And we must also act upon our knowledge more decisively and swiftly. We had a lot of information in advance about potential risks, yet we didn't always act on it and lost precious lead time for risk avoidance and mitigation. This lesson is true not just for the pandemic, but also for the crisis of climate change. We saw how suddenly the COVID crisis started, how quickly it mushroomed. Climate change will cause hundreds of crises that start and grow just as fast. So this crisis has shown that environmental disruptions can wreak havoc with the global economy. They can no longer be ignored. Policymakers need to factor in nature protection and restoration. If we want to protect future generations, we need governments to show the same kind of political will and decisive actions to address climate change that we have seen in recent weeks. Citizens, businesses, all sectors of society must demand this from the governments. Let me stop just by the pollution. So this is one of the lessons learned. We have seen how quickly pollution trends were reversed around the world once polluting activities ceased. We can smell the cleaner air, and people in northern India, for instance, can see the Himalayas for the first time in 30 years. We have the tools to mitigate and even reverse climate change. We just have to be willing to implement them. My last thought goes to Mr. Timmermans, because I read your recent op-ed written with Bertrand Piccard. You talked about the need for the Green Deal in Europe, for a circular and sustainable economy, for replacing old and polluting infrastructure with a modern, clean and efficient one. I couldn't agree more with you. The United Nations speaks of this as building back better. UNEC and the EU already have an excellent collaboration on issues of clean energy and just transition. And we greatly appreciate also your financial support to our activities. And we stand ready to do even more with you on this front. This would be my entrance to this question. Thank you. Go back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So political will is crucially important. Let's turn to our panelists from the private sector. So, Mr. Van Houten, may I ask you, so 3 months ago, we basically didn't have an idea that we would end up in a situation like this due to COVID-19. How has it been to run one of the biggest companies in the world during such a crisis? What have you done to mitigate the business risk and taking care of your people? And, you know, what has been your main learnings?
Thank you, Lisa. Well, for everybody in the call, let's first explain that Philips is a health technology company. We develop and manufacture health technology such as diagnostic equipment, patient monitors, ventilators, informatics to enable care providers to work together and engage patients. And we became first engaged with the COVID situation already late January, as we have large operations in China, about 15% of the company. And we immediately saw that we had to ramp up to deal with the severity of the crisis. And the natural reaction, of course, in the crisis is to take shelter. And many of the government indications were to go into lockdown. But we had to do the opposite, because there is a great need to support all the caregivers to take care of the patients. So we formulated what we call the triple duty of care, and we socialized that with all our 80,000 employees. The triple duty of care is first to deliver to our customers who need to support patients, so taking care of the customer needs. Secondly, to protect, of course, the health and safety of our employees, even though we have 6,000 field engineers that go into hospitals every day to support diagnostic equipment, monitors, ventilators, where all the contagious patients are. And thirdly, to ensure business continuity. Now, as the pandemic spread, the demand for all the acute care equipment went up, and we have seen approximately 8-fold increase in the needs. And that means part of the business was affected and went down, part of the business went massively up. And so we had to reassign people from one part of the company to the next part, even though we were all kind of working from home. And what is amazing, and I'm very proud of the kind of the purpose-driven nature of the people in Philips, where our mission to improve people's lives through innovation now truly becomes alive. And there was no debate that we had to do this. While we were ramping up, we had to navigate partisanship all across the world, because governments were saying, well, you know, you produce in my country and all your production needs to go to my people, right? But there's scarcity. So we had to formulate a kind of fair and equal equipment allocation. And we used the WHO principles that were published around, you know, fair allocation of scarce materials in this pandemic. And I've been on the phone with government leaders all across the world to explain that that's the stance we take. And that, by the way, if you block global supply chains, you will have the opposite effect of getting anything. You will get nothing. Because let's say we are dependent on, we are interdependent in a way, you know, on components and materials from, I don't know, 80 countries in the world. And even though you can have all sorts of academic dialogues, you know, what's the desirable sovereignty of your industry, the fact is today we are interdependent and supply chains need to be open. And so we had to do a lot of crisis management to make that happen. But I must say, governments have responded by keeping borders open. We've also had to organize airlifts because suddenly airplanes don't go anymore to carry medical equipment. And so there was also quite a lot of energy behind arranging these airlifts between continents. And so overall, I think we have been stepping up to our duty of care. And that's going well. We do see, of course, that this brings me to lessons learned, is that the resilience of our healthcare system needs to be relooked, right? Instead of mixing up contagious patients with elective patients all in the same building is not exactly the smartest way to run healthcare system. Whereas you can leverage, you know, cloud technology, telehealth, to make the healthcare system more resilient and less exposed to infection. I think we have to, as we move now gradually into a new normal, have to discuss, you know, how healthcare systems can be organized better. And their data interoperability and digitization will be a very important aspect of the new, more resilient healthcare system. So it's going to be a very fascinating time. Which brings us to our core purpose of improving lives. And we now see the benefit of embracing, in fact, SDGs 3, 12, and 13. I'm sure that we come to talk about how we embed sustainability as well. But we see that being a purpose-driven company makes us actually more resilient for the future. Let me leave it at that for now, Lisa.
Thank you so much. That was a very dramatic story. I mean, I can only imagine how busy everyone at Royal Philips have been in the recent months. So, Mr. Smith, let's hear a little bit from you. I mean, your company is also within technology, but from a quite different perspective. So tell us a little bit about the company, what you have been doing, and what are your learnings from the recent months?
Sure. So yeah, it's definitely going to be a different perspective. So we've been in a very extreme, I would say, extremely privileged position. Most of the trends that this crisis amplifies and accelerates have been the trends that we've been pretty much betting our business on. So we're in the business of digitalization and software solutions and consultancy, and the whole remote work, agility, digitalization, automation. All this stuff is pretty much in our DNA. So this is something that we've been helping our clients with. So in this sense, what we try to do kind of internally, and I think it's the lessons that we've got from there, was to really act fast. Because of this privilege, we were able to kind of close down our offices and move everybody to work from home, more than a week before it was kind of officially mandated. Another thing that was super important to us was to over-communicate. We were probably 2 orders of magnitude smaller than Philips, but still with more than 600 people on board across different locations, we really wanted to double down on our communication efforts. So we kind of amplified all the stuff that we've been doing from monthly to weekly, from quarterly to monthly. And I think something that's maybe a little bit outside of those usual conversations, but something that we always so what we were thinking about was not to panic in some sense. So I think there's this big temptation in those kind of crises to pivot a little bit too far and go maybe kind of outside of your kind of a day-to-day values and things that you do. For us, for example, it was this question about should we go into more of a public space and government solution. So we never done this. It was never a part of our offering. But we thought maybe we should do this. We should kind of pivot quickly in this direction. We decided not to do it, and I think for me the lesson in this was that a lot of the things that we see, and a lot of companies who actually go and are relatively successful or are handling this crisis well, are the ones to really double down on their values, on their culture, on things that they're really, really good at. And again, this is a privileged position to be in because obviously it's hard to stick to your day-to-day operations when you're an airline and your whole fleet is grounded. But for those of us who can do that, I think this is one of the lessons that we had, is that really doubling down on everything that we stand for. We just got certified as a B Corp, so kind of also gave us some additional tools to be able to do that and really stand by our values and double down on what we feel we are good at was one of the major lessons for me personally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Smith. That sounds like a very good recipe for everyone in the coming months to double down on their values and culture. So thank you for sharing that. So, I mean, things are moving very fast. These days, more and more countries in Europe are opening up more and more. And even though other parts of the world are still struggling with the COVID and how to address the pandemic, in Europe, it is the sort of reopening that is pretty much on the agenda now. So, Mr. Timmermans, I would like to come back to you because, I mean, you are playing such a central role in creating the leadership for Europe going forward in this space. So would you please explain a little bit more to us about the Green Deal and how you see that as a sort of way of building back better for Europe and hopefully also the entire world?
Well, thank you. We got the Green Deal because there was an overwhelming support in the European population for doing something about the climate crisis. This was the one issue where almost all across Europe, people agreed that we had an urgency and we needed to act. One of the effects of the COVID crisis is that, of course, people's priorities have changed. They're thinking about their health first and foremost, and then they're thinking about their jobs and their immediate security, etc. But the climate crisis hasn't gone. It's still there. So I think the big challenge we face now is this. There is a huge investment gap. Both public authorities and private business will have to make really difficult choices how we get out of this crisis, because the money isn't there. So we now will have to mobilize the maximum possible investment capacity we can get. And this will give us, if we do it right at a European level, this will give us a shot at recovery. But I fear only one shot, because there's only so much burden we could put on the shoulders of our children and grandchildren. So if we want to use that shot, we better use it well. And the one mistake we need to avoid is to put all that money into restructuring the 20th century carbon-based economy. That would be a tragic mistake if we did that. We need to make sure both private companies that will have to make very sharp choices about where their future lies, financial institutions and public authorities steer our investment towards a sustainable society. on the basis, I would say, in Europe of the Green Deal, on the global scale. We need to look at the development goals and make sure that what we do and the assets we actually put into our society do not become frozen assets within a couple of years' time, because then we will not have the money to do what is needed. And then the climate crisis will remain untackled. And I think it's also a proposition to future generations. Okay, we're putting an extra burden on you now. We have no choice. We need to do it. But we will use that capacity to actually transform our society into a sustainable society. And that's how we will now structure the plans for the European Union. We're hard at work on doing that. And then we will identify some sectors where we will have some priorities. And the three starting positions are the three cornerstones, although you need four, but let me just mention three. The three cornerstones are the Green Deal, our digitization, and our increasing our resilience. And if we direct our efforts in that sense, then I think we can come out of this in a strong way. Now, what are certain areas where we need to pay special attention? I think everything pertaining to building and refurbishing is going to be extremely important, because if we invest, we also have to create jobs as quickly as possible, get the economy going as quickly as possible, and everything pertaining to building and refurbishing and making more resilient and making future-proof of housing and built environment is a winner for everyone. So that we will invest in that. Other sectors, we need to look very carefully at the automotive sector, which is of extreme importance for the European economy. Make sure that we push that sector also into a more sustainable future. And there's the transport sector is of vital importance. How do you get that going again? How do you make sure that if you support them, that they also take measures that take them into a more sustainable future? I mean, these are the big choices we need to make now. And I'm looking forward if there are any questions that are more specific, but I thought I'd just paint a picture more in general terms to start with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Timmermans. And Mr. Van Houten, maybe you can pick up from here, because you run a large company that has already made commitments to setting science-based targets. So you are already well underway with, I think, some of the energy transition that Mr. Timmermans is looking for. So, how are you doing that in practice? I mean, is there a lot of balancing between short-term and long-term investments? Or is this part of your overall strategy? I mean, how do you drive this?
Our whole mission statement is to make the world healthier and more sustainable through innovation. So sustainability is woven into our strategy. It is not an afterthought. It is not a secondary obligation. We have integrated it. And we are well underway to become carbon neutral in our own operations by this year. Almost all our electricity consumption, our energy consumption, is from green electricity sources. It's a commitment that we have made because we believe in it, right? And likewise on circularity, we are increasingly asking our customers to give the equipment back after the economic life of the product, so that we can refurbish, reuse, recuperate scarce materials. We have a zero waste to landfill policy. So maybe I can lift it one level up, because I believe that it's all about leadership. And we heard that from Victor, from Franz. We need people to stand up and take a stance and say, here's where we go. And we diligently go there. And I have a strong conviction that sustainability doesn't have to be more costly. In the end, it will become a growth booster. It will become a profit booster. Undoubtedly, with carbon pricing and maybe border adjustment tariffs around the Green Deal, the companies that have progressed further will find themselves in an advantage. And I have no problem also, and I believe it is good, to shorten supply chains. right? Because that in the end will make the world more resilient. I don't believe in closing borders. So shortening and reshoring for me is not the same as to say we need to have independence, right? I believe the world will remain a multilateral, collaborative, interdependent operation, but we don't have to ship everything 3 times around the world, right? So now if you put a price on all the waste, the market mechanisms will actually turn that into an advantage for the innovators, right? And I very much believe that innovation is a consequence of leadership, right? Making choices about your values and where you want to go. And that's what we do at Philips, and it's working out very well for us. And also we have no hesitation whatsoever that we stay committed on this path. So there's no hesitance that, oh, now we're in a crisis, we need to stop our sustainability commitment. No, not at all. Right? That doesn't even come up as a discussion. Right? So we stay fully committed, and if anything, there's only forward. There's no backward in our plans.
Well, that's definitely good to hear. Ms. Aljadarova, the UN Secretary General is very firm that the road to recovery has to include the 2030 agenda with the 17 global goals and of course the Paris Climate Agreement. But you know, from your perspective, how can the 17 goals be driven more clearly, more firmly across Europe to really, how should I say, be the foundation of building the sort of post-COVID reality in Europe? It's a very powerful agenda that requires a lot of radical innovation. And we are not faring so well on the goals, at least before the COVID. I think even worse now. So what's your take on the future of the 17 goals?
Yes, Lisa, I was speaking about building back better with the help of SDGs. As we see, the pandemic has devastated economies, and huge rebuilding efforts will be necessary when it's done. And correctly, you said our Secretary General has identified this as an opportunity to create more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive societies. We don't have to go back to our old bad habits. And by aligning rebuilding efforts with the SDGs, we can indeed build back better. The SDGs offer us direction on how to redress challenges or prevent certain unwelcome developments. Now we have the decade of action, because till 2030 we have just 10 years to accelerate implementation of the SDGs. And it's upon us to make the 2030 agenda a reality, and we want and need to do it now. So let us rethink, reconnect, and rebuild together. Helping countries rebuild after crisis is something what we at UNEC has experience with. Indeed, UNEC was founded in the wake of World War II with a goal to promote economic cooperation, integration in the pan-European region. And for over 70 years, and even during the height of the Cold War, we have been bringing the East and the West together to collaborate peacefully on technical norms and standards. We work in several fields such as transport, trade facilitation, statistics, environment, housing, etc. And this mandate remains as relevant as ever in the face of the current recession and the need for subsequent rebuilding in alignment with SDGs. Governments, for instance, are now using directives to many different sectors as they reopen for business. I hope they use this opportunity to encourage the discontinuation of old harmful habits and enact stronger policies and incentives. And for this, the SDGs provide an excellent foundation. Why? They facilitate connectivity, address transboundary and other risks, support a green, circular, and resilient recovery. And I would like to stress the word resilient. Implementing the SDGs means that we will be better prepared to respond to and recover from future crises. How? Let me give you some examples from the work of UNEC. We are one of the 5 regional commissions of the United Nations, and we provide a political platform to develop joint responses in a multilateral context based on broad, multidisciplinary technical expertise. Our work is always demand-driven and responsive to emerging trends. Through the collaboration of our 56 member states and often even the larger UN family, it is more far-reaching and impactful than individual action. Moreover, we can offer a number of instruments that are already a meaningful response framework to certain aspects of COVID recovery. One example could be the UN classification system for sustainable resource management called UNFC, or framework classification. It applies to oil, gas, renewable energy, nuclear fuels, minerals, and others, and reduce carbon footprint by optimizing their management, thus helping the circular economy. This UNFC supports several SDGs, such as SDG 7 on clean energy, SDG 10 on infrastructure, SDG 13 on climate action, etc. And the EU notably uses UNFC to manage the critical raw materials needed for batteries and also financially supports our work. But UNFC is also relevant in the COVID context. Hospitals had shortages of critical medications such as anesthesiants, and European manufacturing is hampered by a dependence on imports of active ingredients from China and India. Applying our UNFC can secure the supply chains for these raw materials used in the pharmaceutical industries. This is also relevant to mass-scale vaccine development. Another example we work on is, for instance, I will finish already. I would like to bring SDG 2, zero hunger, by tackling food loss and waste along the entire agricultural supply chain. In times of crisis, it's of course even more important to ensure food supply and avoid panic. And last but not least, also both Frans Timmermans and Frans van Hoyten mentioned transport and connectivity, and Frans van Hoyten was told that he doesn't believe in closing borders. And this was our first emergency response because we are very strong in inland transport. And we tried to open those green corridors so that essential goods could get to the population in the region. Thank you. Come back to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's good, very good to hear these concrete examples of how the UN is helping create common standards, which is really what we will need going forward. So Mr. Smith, if I may come back to you. So you are running a hugely interesting, fast-growing company. You are dealing with the global goals in your daily life. It's part of your business. You were just certified by the B Corp, which is definitely not an easy thing to do. So please share with all of us, I mean, a modern lean company today, how do you really use the global goals to build your business for the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, we are in a space that has huge privilege in this kind of new reality, and I think I would say that there's not going to be this. I mean, all the world is not coming back. I think this is something that I think it's not particularly clear to everybody. When I have conversations with folks, they think about how can we go back to the normal. I don't think there's going to be back to whatever was before the crisis. I think there's going to be a new normal. And we spend a lot of time thinking, not really how to go back to it, but like how can we win in this new reality? And obviously, from a business perspective, it's a little bit different than from the kind of a public perspective. But I think there are some lessons, and we should spend some time figuring out, you know, what this new reality should be, and how can we leverage this. I think obviously the new green. The European Green Deal is one of those kind of examples, but I think, you know, we can also think about smaller things, like how can we maybe cut on business travel? How can we have the EU institutions have more events like that, and you know, kind of save us a little bit of time and a lot of carbon on our flights between Brussels and New York and wherever everybody here is, because I don't really know where people are, to be honest. And then I think this is one of those moments in time where we have this equalizer on the digital space where everybody has to be in this reality, and we don't really have to go to Brussels. We can't really go to Brussels for some of those meetings, and maybe we can learn from this and figure out how can we be more sustainable also in this aspect. Like for us, we've identified our SDGs that we want to focus on, and similar to what Franz was saying, we don't think we need to change those. We're going to double down on the direction that we had previously, and I think this is something that the conversation that we might have as a European community. How can we work together better in the future? How can we prepare for some of those crises, because they're going to come back, and it's going to be a pandemic, it's going to be something else. So far, from my limited historical knowledge, I think that since the creation of European Union, every single crisis made EU stronger, which I hope is going to be the case here as well. And if we can leverage those learnings, those lessons learned, and figure out how can we be stronger in the future, how the business can be stronger, how the union can be stronger, I think this would be a really good outcome of this strategy that we are experiencing right now.
Mm.
Hey, Lisa, can I echo a point that Victor is making? If I'm honest, then I said, we are progressing well on sustainability of our operations, but the one area that we were weak on was business travel, right? And we kind of addicted to business travel. And I think what the crisis has taught us is actually the company functions fine without business travel, right? At least for meetings and executives and so on. So I think we're going to cut down massively on business travel. Right? And I find it a shame that say kerosene and so on is actually not taxed. Right? And I see here in the Zoom chat, that if you want behavior change, you need to, of course, put incentives and disincentives on the things that you want to influence. And I think we all now need to avoid, we go back to normal on business travel, and that would be a nice area to have some leadership there.
Yeah.
Of course, using the nice tools from the cloud community there.
Yeah. So Franz, let me pick up from there, because we are getting closer to the end of our conversation, and I thought it would be really nice if each of you could share your vision for what kind of leadership is needed in Europe going forward. I mean, in a way, it's good to look back, as Mr. Smith is saying, that Europe has been bouncing back stronger many times in its history. How can we make sure that happens again, and that we just don't slide back into the old normal, instead of taking the opportunity to push into a new normal? So what kind of leadership is needed, and what is your advice to our audience today? Mr. Timmermans, may we start with you?
Well, thank you very much. That's a tall order.
Well,
I would say that the one thing we need to fix as a European in our societies, and I'm sure it's not just in Europe, is the fact that we are being crippled by what I would call moral hazard. There is a lack of trust between us. There's a lack of trust within nations. There's a lack of trust between nations. And this, to some extent, is a direct consequence also of earlier crises, where people have felt left behind, ignored, not part of the solution. So if we want leadership to be successful in the future, first of all, we have to make sure we leave no one behind. Secondly, we have to make sure that forms of leadership are found that are inclusive. Thirdly, we have to make sure that we reconnect the vastest majority in our population with our fundamental values. Too many people in our societies now are tempted by forms of authoritarian rule, by scapegoating other people. So in short, the risk we run now in Europe is that because of this crisis, combined with the fundamental changes, tectonic changes in our society caused by this industrial revolution. So change is coming from all sides. We understand the climate crisis and that it's an existential challenge. We are starting to understand that we're in the middle of an industrial revolution that will change the world fundamentally. We now are confronted with a pandemic, and it probably will not be the last pandemic we need to face. So we need to make sure that we have a plan for the future based on an inclusive approach of how we want to organize our society. And we need, I think, to also speak up for democracy and the rule of law. Without democracy and the rule of law, authoritarianism is going to abuse of this situation to silently capture an opportunity. And I think I'm entitled to say that in this crisis we've seen that you cannot solve this problem by blustering. You cannot solve this problem with populist rhetoric. You cannot solve this problem by simply ignoring science. And so the idea that competence, respect for facts, putting science first and foremost, but most of all, creating partnerships across society are the future of leadership that will deliver the changes we need. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Timmermans. That's a full agenda. So, Mr. Smith, what's your view? What's real leadership in Europe going forward?
Look, I'm not going to cover it broadly, I guess, but I think something that comes obviously from my bias is that I think this leadership is going to transition into a more digital leadership. And what I mean by that is that I think, being visible, either internally or externally online as a leader of a business or any kind of organization is no longer like a millennial thing to do. I think this is something that we now all, and every leader, I guess, over the last weeks or months experience, that they have to have a way to communicate. They have to have a way of lead, not being physically in the same place or office. And I think this is something that needs to be, we're going to stay with us for after this crisis, among obviously all the other things. But I just wanted to mention this part.
Yeah, which can have a huge impact on many other things. So thank you, Mr. Smith, for that. Ms. Aljarova, leadership for the future in your mind.
Yes, we already touched a lot of important factors. I really hope that the post-COVID-19 leadership will be conscious of our vulnerability to crisis and take steps to be better prepared, especially in terms of rapidly responding and transitioning to a climate neutral economy. So circular economy, a just transition to zero carbon energy systems, building resilience and sustainability, PPPs, all of these are needed. And of course, the leadership should always keep an eye on the future and focus on bolstering countries' innovation capacity to enhance sustainable growth. And UNEC can support governments by providing the technical tools to implement them. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, let's remember that we are together in this. We have seen an erosion of confidence in multilateralism in the last few years, but without collaboration and coordination, countries will often work at cross-purpose and miss in synergies. Therefore, I would like to urge here all leaderships to make full use of the collaborative platforms. One of them is the UN. We are at your service, and together in solidarity, we can reach the future we hope for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Van Houten, it's all about leadership. What does it look like? You're muted.
Europe has 500 million people. That's a lot of people. And we got to inspire them, right? And to inspire them, you need to have a clear North Star where we are going, right? Then we need to take the people along. And we need to be competitive as a region. And therefore we need to transform, right? We cannot hold on to the old things and think that it will be okay. It won't, right? We need an honest conversation about that. And of course, we need to embrace the future, which is digital and AI and a lot of new things. So Europe needs to go on a transformation journey, right? And it will take very courageous leadership to get there. And that's a tall order, as Frans Timmermans said, but we better put our shoulders under it. And then I think we can make it an exciting journey as well.
Thank you so much to all of you and your great interpretations of what kind of leadership we need for the future. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us today. And now I'm really keen to see how other parts of the world are defining the leadership that we need for the future. But thank you so much to our wonderful panel. And I also want to invite you for our academy on Thursday, which is about the global supply chain, focusing on shipping. And on the following Tuesday, we will dive into the business ambition for 1.5 degrees, uniting business to recover better. Finally, thank you to all our audiences today. I hope to see you all at UN Global Compact's 20-year anniversary summit that will be digital, of course, on the 15th and 16th in June, where we will debate again how we build better and stronger for the future. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Marius.